the work of boards in budgeting. We'll make use of 2 recorded presentations, the first of which is by Brent Kay, a superintendent in Orange Southwest Supervisory Union, helping us look broadly at what assumptions we should take in developing budgets. Steve will focus in on budgeting or considerations that we think are critical to look at in this year. And then the last presentation will be a strategy used by Lamoille South Supervisory Union, which they refer to as a multi-year budget cycle. So again, to start with the broad role of the board, we use this phrase about boards acting as trustees on behalf of the community to provide oversight. And that oversight, we think, focuses in 3 areas. You'll notice that number 1 is high quality of education. Number 2 is that the public gets a good return on its investment. So in order to fill that role, it's important for the boards to develop a trusting relationship with the community. So refer to you as trustees. That implies there's an effort to build trust with the community. And boards can do that most effectively by being clear about what your expectations are and verifying that you're getting the results you're asking for. So we might call that the system operating effectively and ethically. It touches also on the budgeting and monitoring functions that I'll speak more about in a moment here. This summary is the list of tasks or actions that we identify as the ways or the actions to fulfill that broad role and responsibility that you have. This is taken from our publication, The Essential Work of Vermont School Boards, and is a resource that's referenced on our website as well as in print. So here are the discrete actions that we think add up to fulfilling your role. And you'll notice right at the beginning, and much of what we focus on tonight, is the idea of building and adopting a budget that supports a vision. So the visioning is a critical piece of thinking about and planning for your budget. I want to connect it also briefly with the responsibility you have to monitor progress toward that vision. So creating a vision comes first, and budgeting is one of the tools that you can employ to fulfill your vision. Then monitoring is a critical check on how you're doing. So for instance, if you decide you're going to allocate a certain amount of money for the arts, you ought to be clear about what outcomes you expect from that investment. They might be in terms of student involvement, pure numbers, could be in witnessing performances directly, or you could describe more general learning experiences that you want students to take away from their experience in the arts. Then you need to figure out how are we going to measure that. And we used our webinar last week to look very specifically at monitoring practices. That presentation is also available on our website. In any case, as I mentioned, there are lots of ways you could collect that information, whether it be pure numbers of involvement, the boards witnessing these experiences and getting a firsthand perspective on what's happening in terms of student opportunity and learning, as well as community involvement, student testimonials. There are a lot of strategies that you can use. But those 3 components of the essential work are really where we're focused tonight: visioning, developing a budget, and monitoring. Vision. As I mentioned, its importance, I want to underscore that the vision is a way of capturing what's important to the community. We've said in many ways what we value as a statewide public education community. And in fact, the presentation from Brent Kay will focus largely on our commitment to equal educational opportunity. At a local level, you also have the opportunity to define what you want for your students. That provides a guide to your budgeting decisions. So it's important that those kinds of conversations provide high-level principles to guide your work. So we'd like to take a poll to get a sense of where people's work is currently. In a moment, you'll see a poll sort of guide come up, and it's really a yes-no question. Do you have a district or supervisory union vision that guides your budget building? So 75% said yes, you do have a vision that guides your budget building. Let me ask a follow-up question, and you can respond in the question box or verbally. How does your vision guide your budget building? Is there any specific action or activity or practice that your board has that translates the vision into a budgeting activity?
One person, Jennifer, says we have a vision, but it does not directly translate into budgeting. I think that may be fairly common, and one of our pitches tonight to you is to be thinking about what it is you want to become as a district, what do you want for your students, and are you in fact true to that vision as you're prioritizing items within your budget.
Let me give one example, and then we're going to move forward. In our monitoring webinar last week, Mark Andrews, the superintendent in Essex Town, talked briefly about the list of assumptions that he presents his boards with in advance of developing the very first draft of the budget. And the first assumption he made was that the budget they built would move the school toward its vision and fulfilling the agenda for a world-class education, which is a public policy framework that the School Boards Association and the Superintendents Association has collaborated on. So right from the outset, he makes it clear that those are assumptions he's using, which then leads to conversations about how certain decisions in the budget support or fulfill that effort. So we'll continue to look for your comments as we go forward here. But let me move us into the presentation by Brent Kay. We asked Brent to paint a broad picture, philosophical and in many respects maybe moral and at this point legal, that guide our thinking as a state about developing budgets. And it's largely based on the principles of equal educational opportunity.
Hi folks, this is Brent Kay, Superintendent of the Orange Southwest Supervisory Union. Today, we hopefully will provide you with a framework to consider when developing your local school budgets. The first thing I'd like to say is, having come from the world of corporate finance many years ago and moving into education, is that the world of educational finance is far more complicated than that of corporate finance. For example, as officials in the public education system, our primary charge is to ensure that all children receive an equal educational opportunity. As stated in this slide, unlike private corporations that primarily exist to make profit, public schools exist to ensure all children receive the equal education opportunity that we talked about in the last slide. Most of us are familiar with the steps that states take to ensure equal educational opportunity, or EEO, for example, Acts 60 and 68. However, when local school boards develop their budgets, there are things they should do also to ensure that resources are allocated in a way that promote equal opportunities or equity for all children. Many of you will recall the Brigham case of 1996, where it was proved that Vermont's funding system at that time did not provide an EEO for all children. There are two principal tenets of equity. The first is horizontal equity, which means treating equals equally, and that means that all towns must have equal spending power for equal taxation. The second is vertical equity, which means treating unequals unequally, and in short that means that the funding formula in the state must ensure that towns who have extraordinary costs that are unique to their area must receive additional funding to offset those costs. And an example of that would be a town with extraordinarily high special education costs versus a town that has extraordinarily low special education costs. The funding formula in the state of Vermont therefore must offset the extraordinary costs in the district that is incurring those costs. In response to the Brigham case, the Vermont legislature enacted Act 60 in 1997 and Act 68 in 2003. While in 1997 the legislature responded quickly with Act 60 to deal with inequity, it realized shortly after that it needed to take further steps. So in 2003 it enacted Act 68, which effectively centralized all tax revenues dedicated to education into the Education Fund, which exists today. Through the enactment of Act 60 and 68, the state legislature in Vermont ensured our funding formulas provided for an EEO for all children. However, at our level, boards and administrators have a primary role to ensure that we allocate the funds we receive in a way that ensures all children receive EEO in schools across our district.
So that leads naturally to your question here. How can boards of a supervisory union develop budgets that ensure EEO in all schools within their jurisdiction?
All right, there are several things we can do. First, we can make sure that a vision and mission statement is in place in our schools and that everybody understands them, that goals and desirable outcomes are, or desired outcomes are in place. And those are important because when we develop budgets, we should make sure that our budgets align with what those desired outcomes and the vision and mission of the school are. And there are simple things like looking at our school budgets collectively across all schools, make sure that a budget process is in place, or make sure that the board sets budget parameters before the process of budgeting begins.
So Brent, before we go on to this next slide, I have a follow-up question. With respect to EEO, how can boards achieve the directives they need to follow regarding equal educational opportunity and still respect and really promote the values and goals that they hold locally?
That's a really good question because people will often confuse what you need to do to ensure EEO with a cookie cutter approach, and it's not that way at all. To achieve EEO, you have to make sure that resources are allocated across the district in an equitable way. By doing so, you actually provide local schools the monetary resources they need to actually develop and reflect curricular practices, field trips, community involvement initiatives, anything like that in creative ways that are very unique to their local schools. If you don't allocate your resources equitably, what inevitably happens is one school will get the lion's share of curricular resources or technology resources or whatever you want, and the other schools won't have those resources and therefore lag. And that's what leads to inequitable opportunities. Shall we listen on it? All right, moving on to the purposes of budgets. And before we do this, I want to state that later we're going to get into providing you with explicit examples and tools that you can use within your school system that hopefully can help you keep focused on what the purposes of budgets are. Now here is just a brief example of 6 statements of why you develop budgets. And they're relatively straightforward, and you can read through them. It really is a statement of what's important. It also is a means to ensuring equal educational opportunities for all children, and that's what we've explored over the last 10 to 15 minutes. And there are multiple of other reasons, so these are just samples of those, of the purposes of developing budgets.
We thank Brent Kay for taping that little piece. It is, I think, very helpful at helping us think broadly about the context for building our budgets. This is Steve Dale. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont School Boards Association. I've taken the mic from Harry to move now into a few more concrete thoughts about budgeting. So the first question is the role of the board in budgeting. When I was on a school board many years ago, we had a tendency to get out a spreadsheet and to start going through a set of numbers that had been put in front of us, and we began to decide how much to budget for paper, how much to, how many each kind of staff to budget for, We did all of the detailed budgeting as a board. We do not encourage you to do that. We believe that the board has a much more well-defined and broader role, and that's what I want to go through with you quickly here. The first thing that boards should be doing are establishing parameters when you're setting a budget. You're being clear on the overall vision, as we just discussed. You're being clear on priorities. You need to be clear what is more important than other things. If there are absolutes, if you have strong opinions about class size ratios, particular programs that you want to protect, regardless of what else is happening, you need to make that clear to your administration. You need to be clear on the outside parameters of the bottom line. What is the limit of taxpayer capacity to support a budget? What is appropriate in the current environment for you to put forward to your voters? So you are establishing parameters to start with. You're then asking administrators to put together a draft budget for you. And you're encouraging creativity and collaboration by your administrators. You're proposing that in order to achieve the objectives and to achieve the vision, to stay within the financial parameters, do they need to consider combining staff and programs within the school? Might they need to come together with other schools within the supervisory union to see if there's ways to come together and protect that Spanish program that may only have 5 students from your school, but the neighboring school may be able to have some extra capacity? Is it time to consider some joint ventures and mergers that will allow you to live within those budget parameters? But you should be asking your administrators to come up with a budget that achieves your vision and also that respects the parameters that you've laid out. It's important to assure that you have a healthy and open and iterative process. You should expect that the administration is going to come back with a budget that meets the parameters, and they may also share with you the consequences of having met those parameters, because sometimes it may not be easy to achieve everything. So they need to come back with their best thinking. We would urge you to have a healthy back and forth discussion to sort out board desires and parameters and the realities of the operation. There does need to be back and forth discussion. It's not a simple, we lay out the parameters, you come back with a budget. There's going to be back and forth so that you can understand the realities and continue to sort through your priorities. We urge you to avoid micromanaging line items. Expect the administrators to meet your parameters and develop proposals that will get the best return on dollars invested. But we would urge you that they should own those proposals and those ideas. The more that the board micromanages every line item in the budget, the less accountable your administrators. And finally, at the end of the discussion, the superintendent and the board must be able to both be comfortable enough with the final proposal to present and defend it to the community. So ultimately, there needs to be a coming together on what is your final budget, and is it something that can be defended to your community. And the last thing I'm going to mention is, in terms of the board's job, this probably goes without saying, but many boards struggle with the difficult decisions, especially regarding personnel reductions where they may be needed. There are many difficult budget decisions. This is the most difficult, and we urge you to be willing to make difficult decisions when they need to be made, and we'll be talking more about that in a few minutes. My last general note about budget building is a note on supervisory union budgets. As an elected district board member, you also have a responsibility for the effective operation of the supervisory union. We urge you to use the same principles that we just talked about and that Brent just talked about in developing and improving a supervisory union budget. But perhaps most important on this slide is this concept that school board members, district board members need to own the supervisory union budget. It is a budget that is approved by a deliberative process representing all of the boards in the region. The services delivered through the supervisory union are critical to the overall operation, and it is part of your responsibility as a board member. Many citizens in our communities really struggle with trying to figure out what is the supervisory union, what is this supervisory union budget. Sometimes it's easy to talk about it like it's something from another planet, but the fact is ultimately local boards need to own the SU budget, so you need to be sufficiently invested that you're engaged in what that budget looks like, and once it's approved, being part of the process of interpreting it to your community. I was realizing as Harry was talking earlier that this probably should say building a budget for fiscal 2015 as opposed to building a budget in 2013. But the fact is, what the next few things I want to talk about relate to your current budgeting process that you're probably just beginning now. And in fact, it would be good to know how many of you that are on this webinar, if you could just raise your hands, how many of you are already beginning to discuss the budget in your districts? I certainly would hope that during the month of November that conversation will begin, because most boards do the bulk of their budget work late November, December, and certainly most people are wrapped up by the middle of January. As I go through this next section with some specific ideas, I wanted to start with a disclaimer. I'm going to be making a number of specific recommendations, and it would be easy to say, well, that recommendation doesn't apply to me. There are no assumptions in this presentation about the circumstances that each of you faces individually. However, our pitch would be that it's critical that you be honest about what your situation is in your particular district. And if the ideas that are presented today have relevance for you, we urge you to take them seriously and act on them. It is conceivable that some of you are from districts that actually have increased student populations, and you may be dealing with a whole unique set of circumstances. So as we go forward, I'll be asking you a little bit about your situation. So there's several realities that we want you to keep in mind when building your budget this year. And this is a big deal because, frankly, politicians everywhere, you may have read it in the paper, but politicians at all levels are beginning to ask the question, what's happening with education spending? What are we going to do about it? And it is very important that every one of us connected with school boards are taking this conversation perhaps more seriously than ever before. I know we always take it seriously, but I think you'll see why as I go forward. So the first item that I want you all to keep in mind, first idea as you approach the budget, is that we are all linked. Each district board is sitting down spending lots of time sorting out their budget for next year, and you're agonizing over what's going to happen in each of your individual schools with each individual program. That is how it's designed, that's your task, and that's critical work. But remember that the budget you build and that your electorate approves will affect the tax rate for the whole state. We are all linked by the current education finance system we have. It is both the fairest system in the United States. It assures that for the same tax effort that our students have approximately equal amounts of money being expended on their behalf, not perfectly, but generally better than most. However, once you have approved your budget and all the other towns have approved their budget, it all goes into a great big pool called the Ed Fund, and it will get paid for, and the taxpayers in Vermont will get taxed for it. So we are all linked. So we urge all school boards to be thinking of the budget building process as not just my school, but I at some level am a part of a much bigger picture. And as this item says, as local school boards, we have an obligation to figure out a responsible budget for our local schools, but as a group of 300 school boards whom we represent in the VSBA, we have a collective responsibility to keep our aggregate budget reasonable. And I'm just making a pitch that I think it's important, if possible, for the aggregate budget to come in at something under 3%. We have continued to have declining enrollment that I'll show you in a minute. Last year the budget went up 5%, and it was quite distressing to many folks in the state. It's just an observation from where I sit and based on what I hear. The second thing that I want you to keep in mind is that statewide, our budgets have continued to rise in a time of declining enrollment. I've already mentioned school spending rose over 5% last year. That was after a couple of years of slight decrease, fairly flat, and 3%. So we had 3 years that were well within range. But last year, school spending rose over 5%, while the number of students dropped by over 600. There are many people in the areas who analyze expenses and projections who are projecting a similar increase for this year, while the number of students is continuing to fall. This is all part of the backdrop. You need to keep it in mind. This is a picture of what's happened with our student population. Back around 2000, we were over 100,000. We're now down to under 86. It might be closer to 84 or 82 going into the next school year. Somewhere along the line, it begins to bottom out. However, you can see that when budgets are rising and people are looking at the number of students being educated, there's a challenge. Related to that is that our per pupil cost, this is all part of the same math, our per pupil cost continues to rise. And this is probably the single biggest driver for the angst on the part of the General Assembly. Our per pupil spending is now among the highest in the country. And I'm going to show this graph. Some of you have seen this before. The red bars are the per pupil costs in 2002, and the blue bars are the per pupil cost in 2012. And as you can see, over that decade, Vermont's per pupil spending rose faster than any other state in New England. By the way, this is just New England, plus the number for the United States over on the left. The rate of increase in Vermont is what has been, I think, most troubling, and obviously it's been driven largely by the fact that student population has been falling and our cost structure has not been adjusted accordingly. So we ask you to keep all of this in mind as you're dealing with your budget this year. There are upward pressures that everyone experiences. Their healthcare costs, I think most of you are probably aware that VHI recently announced that their projected rate increase for next year is 4.5%. That's good news, especially after last year's number that was budgeted at the beginning of 14%. I think in the end it came in around 10%, but 4.5%, it's still an upward pressure. Fuel costs, hard to say what those are going to do. At the moment, it seems positive, but those are very volatile. And obviously, there's inflation pressures on a number of fronts. There are also realities we need to respond to. The contract obligations in your collective bargaining agreements, granted, all boards had to agree to those ultimately, so they don't come at us from nowhere. However, there's a statewide picture, and many times you've made those agreements 2 or 3 years out. Those are agreements that have to be paid. There are new requirements and mandates every year from the legislature. The Superintendent's Association has been spearheading a look at all of the mandates that have come at us in the last 15 years just to educate people, because it's important the general public understand that when school boards are increasing their budgets, it's not because people sit around and say, we ought to raise these budgets. Part of it is because there were new requirements added almost every year. We need to educate the public about that, even if they're the best initiatives that ever were. It's important that people understand there are costs. And we need to keep moving education forward. We can't sit back and say, gosh, it's a tight economy, there's not a lot of money, therefore we need to promote the status quo. Obviously, there are areas such as technology where we need to continue to make investments, and it's very difficult to simply turn our back on those kinds of initiatives. So the question, of course, for all of you is, what is a board to do? So you've got all these pressures not to spend money, that our per pupil cost is rising tremendously. We've got a number of upward costs. Before I give you what I hope will be some helpful information, I want to caution every board member on something never to say. And I know many board members have said it, and I've probably said it myself when I was a board member, but it's this. We can't really control the budget since it is mostly driven by staff salaries, health benefits, special education, etc. We, school board members, make many, many decisions which can affect the overall cost of education, including the items that are listed on this page. And there is nothing, I think, that folks, citizens, like to hear less than the people that they've elected to oversee education and oversee the kind of investment that we're making in education, feeling like they have no control. And I hope the pitch that I'll make in the next few minutes will convince you that maybe there are ways that you can control your biggest cost drivers. I want to focus on two major areas of the budget that in my experience, as I've watched budgets the last couple of years, are probably the two biggest drivers. And I'm going to get some help from a guy by the name of Nathan Levinson from a group called the District Management Council. He recently put out a book called Smarter Budgets, Smarter Schools. He was also one of the key speakers at our conference a couple of weeks ago at Lake Maury. He has many proposed ideas, some of them very controversial, but I think you'll find some of the information that I'll share. When I put up a slide from him, I will attribute it to him, and I think you'll see what I mean, that these are very helpful ideas that can open the doors for a broader look at different approaches to budgeting. The first area is staffing levels, and I'm going to spend the most time on that because it is by far the biggest area of expenditure, which means that it is both the biggest challenge to be faced, but it is also potentially the biggest area to address the cost pressures that you experience. First statement about staffing is that staffing levels have not tracked the reduction in students. In most budgets, 80% of costs are associated with personnel, but as student counts have fallen in many districts, the number of staff has not dropped. This is a picture of what's happened to our total teacher and paraprofessional staffing since 2004. That's the same 10 years as the chart I showed a few back that showed the decline in pupil population of about 10% or more. Our staffing levels have stayed basically flat, a little bit up, a little bit down, but over a 10-year period it's been pretty flat in the face of over a 10% decrease in the number of students. This little graph comes from the District Management Council. This is federal data. What it shows is that back in 1955, a different time, a different place, I happened to be around back then, so I know what it looked like back then. Certainly kids with disabilities were not in the public school. Certainly the level of behavior challenges were not what they are today. We didn't have nearly the expectations. There's all kinds of reasons why student-teacher ratios were very different in 1955. But nationally, you can see what has happened. We've gone from 27.4 students per teacher. These are teachers, by the way, not all staff, to 14.9 students per teacher nationally. And in Vermont, we are at 11.6 students per teacher. This chart is, I think, interesting. Don't get hung up on the items on the left-hand side of the fulcrum there. This is another one from Nathan Levinson. But basically what he's trying to show is that every time we make a decision to continue to reduce class size, and by the way, our average class size has continued to drop over that lengthy period. Every time we choose to keep on all of our teaching staff and all of our support staff, we are doing one of two things. We are either increasing the per pupil cost. We could, in fact, reduce that per pupil cost for the benefit of taxpayers, or we are not spending on other areas that could enhance the overall education program for our children in terms of other course offerings, mentoring for new teachers, coaching for our principals, curriculum development, etc. He's got a number of things on that left side, but regardless of what they are, the point of this slide is there are choices to be made, and the decision to not address student-teacher ratios in ways that are not going to negatively affect kids. Obviously, there's a point at which I don't think most schools in Vermont do not want to have a race to the to a bad pupil student-teacher ratio, but there is a balance point where, in fact, we are working against the best education available for our students by continuing to not address that very difficult issue. So the question is, another slide from the District Management Institute Council, District Management Council. Another slant is this slide, which shows the 3 reasons why we don't tend to have our student-teacher ratios adjusted as student populations fall. He calls it downward stickiness. When classes get big, we add teachers. And we add them fairly quickly. When we get to a certain number, we say it's time for another 3rd grade to be created. However, when student populations begin to fall, our natural tendency is to be much slower to reduce by a 3rd grade. So we just need to be aware of that so we can be conscious of it in decision making. The second is what he calls single building preference. Certainly all teachers, most teachers like to feel part of one school community. They don't particularly like to have their time divided between 2 or 3 school communities, and principals certainly prefer single building staff who can become part of the team. Clearly there are benefits to all teachers being part of a single building team. However, when we're talking about the cost issues that we're all facing, there may well come a time when we need to reduce our teaching staff from a full-time person to a half-time person, or split a position between 3 schools. And although we may not particularly like that, or the teacher may not particularly like it, it may be the best way we can preserve the best program for the greatest number of students within a reasonable cost. And the last one is full-time preference. Many of us, and I put myself in this camp, much prefer to hire full-time employees because you get 100% of their effort. We know that people who work full-time tend to work extra hours. I mean, you get a lot of mileage from full-time employees, and when you start saying, well, we're only going to hire somebody 2 days a week, clearly people draw much clearer boundaries around that kind of time frame. However, the challenge to you all is when you're thinking about your budget, it may be that you, in fact, can preserve more programming and offer more opportunities to your kids by being willing to say, you know something, if we had only a part-time person in this area, then we could do something else in another area. And it becomes much more difficult in small districts than it is in great big schools where you can move people around a lot. So my last comment on this is the need for tough decisions. Reducing staff requires action. It can be very difficult in small communities where you know the people, where you know who the good teachers are, where you may have children in those classrooms. It's just important to acknowledge those difficulties and then be willing to do the analysis that's necessary so you can make the right decision. The goal is to preserve or expand education offerings in the face of reductions in student enrollment, and this may at times require joint ventures or mergers or other creative strategies. And I often will come back to I mean, I know many boards who find themselves faced with, are we going to have to basically do away with the arts? Because we lost 10 students last year, we don't have the revenue within our per pupil cost to say we can keep those programs going. Something has to go, so we start to cut. And my strong pitch to you is to be very intentional and be willing to make hard personnel choices in this regard in order to preserve program. So we're going to go to a second poll, and the question for you all is, have you looked at student-staff ratios and taken steps to manage them effectively to maximize student opportunity and minimize cost? Okay, so 60% of folks, yeah, it wasn't just maximize student opportunity, it's also achieve and minimize the cost. So some of you have and some of you haven't. So let me ask a quick show of hands, if you would. If you have experienced a reduction in student numbers over the last year or two, raise your hand. All right, so I'm not totally talking in the dark here. All right, so and I'm going to ask the flip side. So if you could, and then how many of you have actually experienced increases? And I will assume the others. All right, so we had a couple of increases. Okay, and the others maybe have been about level. Normatively in this state, I'd say probably 70% or 80% of school districts have experienced decreases. We do have some that are continuing to increase, and recently we've had more that are holding their own. So that's good news. Now there's a second area, which is just a small little area for discussion, and I know these are none of these are non-controversial, but given the magnitude of what we face, it seems to me that it's important to be able to talk about everything. Special ed costs are rising faster than other costs in many locations, and I want to say two things right up front so that people don't leave this webinar and say, gosh, the VSBA told us to do one of these items. So the first is, it is not the role of the board to be analyzing individual programs. I know you know that. I'm sure you've been told that by all of your staff. Yeah, these are complex, difficult judgments. There's an elaborate legal framework within which IEPs are designed and delivered, and we are not suggesting that boards get into the business of deciding how we're going to meet Johnny's needs. That's really not the role of the board. Certainly, our objective here is not to vilify students with disabilities. I know there are some small towns when you have a dramatic increase in your special ed budget, people in town think they may know which children moved into town, which challenged the budget. Obviously, that's horrible when that happens, shouldn't happen, and we by no means are suggesting that we get into any of that kind of conversation. However, it is also very important that boards not get into the headset that I've heard people say to me many times, well, we built our budget, we scrutinized every line item, and then there was this item that was $250,000 of new special ed money, and we just have to put that in and we can't talk about it. I would suggest to you that the board role is in analyzing practice patterns, ratios, and comparisons so that you can judge the practice in your district and how it relates to norms within your supervisory union, across the state, nationally, and so on. Those are very legitimate areas that you ought to be talking about, and you ought to be asking your administrators to explain to you. And if you feel like you're really out of step with norms in terms of best practices, there ought to be an expectation that that your folks are going to be working on that over the coming year. The kinds of things you might look at are percentage of students identified as needing special ed services and 504 services. The rate of identification of students is very divergent district to district, and that information should be available to you to look at. So you ought to be asking, what percentage of our students have we been identifying as needing special ed? Now, some of that's very legitimate. There are different demographics in each community, but there are definitely practice variations that have to do with patterns of behavior. There are times when there are certain schools that will be more likely to be responsive to people that suggest a particular label. There may be programs that have been put together that are very attractive, and people actually seek out those programs and need a label. There's all kinds of things that can go on. And part of your board responsibility is to have a general sense of how are we administering our special ed program and what kinds of services are we using, which is the next thing, the rate of utilization of specific services. One of the issues that has been raised is that we have a very high, as a state, usage of paraprofessionals. And it would be very important for you to know what is your per capita use of paraprofessionals. in your district compared with those of other districts or the state or the country? What about the use of residential placements, et cetera, some of the big cost drivers. And then obviously part of what you're interested in is, in a time when we're trying to make sure that we're personalizing education for all children, how do we be responsive to every student to fully engage them in ways that promote their success? And the more and the better we can do that for every student, it could lead us to a place where we may, for some children, need less special services. So there are many things that boards can talk about, and I think it's a mistake to consider this area to be off limits for discussion. This is a slide from Nathan Levinson, which shows, and this is a national slide, and the print is pretty tiny, so it may be hard to see it. But what he was trying to demonstrate is that there are districts in this country where the special education teacher to student ratio is 270% more than another district. So that you can see 270% difference between the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile. And in terms of the use of paraprofessionals, there's a 430% differential. The point being that we have across the country and certainly across the state developed practice patterns that vary widely. He contends that the student results in those various, across that spectrum, are not radically different. In other words, you cannot say, well, because the ratio was 20 special ed teachers to 1,000 students, therefore the success indicators are substantially greater. He would make the case that there's not a direct correlation. The point of this is not to get into an area that I'm not qualified to get into, which is what is best practice for special education, but it's really to be willing as a board member to take a very high-level review of what's happening with your special ed costs and how do they compare with the rest of the state, and is there an explanation for it, or is it a matter of practice? And if it's a matter of practice, looking for your administrators to report to you on what the alternatives are, how some other people are delivering the service, and so on and so forth. It's the high-level monitoring function. So I'm going to ask another poll question. Do you feel you as a district are adequately reviewing special education practice patterns and costs? All right. So, well, this is one that has a clear answer. I think this is pretty common where board members feel quite in the dark. And in these times, it is very important, while totally valuing federal and state law in this area and totally respecting the confidentiality of individual students, but where boards can play a more active, broad oversight role. This is just a slide to indicate that if you have any questions or comments about any of the slides that Nathan Levinson put together, or if you're interested in more information of that type, here's some contact information for him. And I would again refer you to his book, which is available, I assume, through most of the major outlets, called Smarter Budgets, Smarter Schools. And again, controversial but challenging, and I think the people who came to our conference generally found him to be appropriately challenging and raising a lot of the right kinds of questions.
Thanks, Steve. So as we've taken a big picture look at considerations for budgeting, both through Steve's presentation and Brent's framing our work broadly in terms of equity, we'd like to offer you one other piece of information, which is a approach to budgeting developed and practiced in Lamoille South Supervisory Union. The presentation is given by the Superintendent Tracy Brand and the Director of Finance and Operations, John Pike. We hope this will provide a balance to these big picture considerations we've put before you and provide a comprehensive process for developing and managing a budget.
Welcome. My name is Tracy Rend, and I'm Superintendent of Lamoille South Supervisory Union. I'm joined this evening by my colleague, John Pike, the Director of Finance and Operations for Lamoille South. Our goal is to tell you about the year-round budget development process we use in LSSU and how we use that process to ensure alignment between our vision for public education in the communities we serve, data and evidence, and the development and management of a budget that supports our vision. In each of the districts of the Lamoille South Supervisory Union, budget is considered a policy document that establishes a framework for the management of the school system. Budget is one of the most important responsibilities of the board, as it is essential that the budget advances the mission and vision, and it's also important as a frame for engaging and interacting with the community. Understanding that budget is much like a policy or vision statement, there are 3 key ideas to keep in mind as you think about budget. First, as I mentioned, budget is an important frame for community engagement, but the implications of that are deeper than community interest in tax rates and quality of education in local schools. Budget management is the bedrock for the foundation of trust between education stakeholder groups. In order to have the time and trust to focus on education, on students, on teaching and learning, the financial house must be in order. Second, clear roles and responsibilities are essential. Whether you're talking about development, administration, or accountability for any part of the budget cycle, in order to be efficient and effective, roles and responsibilities need to be clear. And thirdly, budget development is year-round work. For the rest of the presentation, we explain the year-round budget cycle to give you an idea on a practical level of how we in LSSU think about, develop, manage, and administer budgets to sustain that trust through having the financial house in order and to advance a vision for quality education in our schools. We'll begin by giving you an overview of the year-round budget development cycle stages and how they play out over the course of a calendar year. Then we'll go into a little more detail about each of the stages. We think of the year-round budget cycle as having 8 stages. Budget engagement is the work of the board and work done with the community to explore priorities and needs. It's also a time for the board to learn about research and best practices and other important understandings such as education funding in Vermont. Budget development is the translation of a district's vision and priorities to a specific budget for a particular fiscal year. Budget approval begins once a board has adopted a budget and involves working with the community to ensure an informed vote on town meeting day. Budget implementation is the work between town meeting and July 1st, the beginning of a fiscal year, to make necessary changes and set the foundation for operating within a budget. The last 4 stages are just what they sound like. Budget management is purchasing, encumbering, paying invoices, reprioritizing, and freezing. Budget closeout is the closing of the books at the end of the fiscal year. Budget audit is the annual financial audit, and budget reporting is the review of the audit results by the board and reporting to the community and other key stakeholder groups. There is an important role for board members in overseeing the effective implementation of all stages, but the stages highlighted in yellow are the stages where boards have the leading role. These stages play out in a multi-year process that actually spans 3 years.
As Tracy indicated on the previous slide, we view the budgeting cycle as a multi-year process which spans over a period of approximately 3 years. This process commences with the budget engagement process shortly after town meeting day each year and culminates with the audit process and inclusion of the audit report in our annual report to ensure accountability to the community. This next slide shows how the budget cycle overlaps on a continual basis. As highlighted in yellow, you can see that in May of 2013, we will actually be dealing with 3 different budget cycles, being the management of the FY13 budget, implementation of the FY14 budget, and engagement in the FY15 budget cycle.
Now for a little more detail on each of the stages. Budget engagement, as we have framed it in the calendars on previous slides, spans from April to September. Actually, it is year-round work, but from April to September, it is the primary work of the board with the community. The goal of budget engagement is to make sure the board has the information needed to make good decisions in a compressed time frame. That time frame when we have complete information about all three parts of a budget: the proposed expenditures, the anticipated revenues, and the tax rate implications. It is also an important opportunity for community dialogue and input. Board engagement in the districts of LSSU spans a range of items, from concrete to abstract and broad to specific. Engagement is not just about the future. It involves reflecting on the impact of the decisions of the past and may play out in board agendas as a review of things like energy utilization or a reflection on the impact of a new or revised program. Some examples of budget engagement topics on the agendas of school boards in LSSU are listed on this slide and range from a review of research on middle-level best practice to the exploration of technology enhancement opportunities in our region. We don't always put specific dollar amounts to these items. Rather, we identify where they might fit as a priority for resources and support in the future, with an eye to the overall vision for the school system.
Our budget development process kicks off with our first administrators meeting in early September. We present to administrators a budget timeline and expectations for submission of building-based budgets based on building administrators' work with staff at their respective buildings. Discussions with the board and community during the budget engagement process are factored into building a draft budget that takes into consideration staffing needs and other program costs to deliver educational programs that satisfy community needs. At the budget kickoff meeting, roles and responsibilities are clearly defined, and model forms are provided to ensure consistency in submitting information that will be compiled in a draft budget. Once a draft budget is completely developed, consideration is given to expectations communicated by the board and community during the budget engagement process. A revised draft budget is compiled, and tax rate implications are developed based on preliminary assumptions relating to the several variables used in the tax rate calculation, including anticipated revenues, particularly relating to special education grants and reimbursements, as well as other state grants, equalized pupils, base education amount, the base homestead and non-homestead tax rates, and the CLA. Ongoing revisions to our estimated tax rates are made as new information is received from the state throughout November and December. Presentation of a recommended budget is formally made to the board and community in early January. Over the course of the month, the board takes the opportunity to reflect on the recommended budget and request additional information from the administration, and to consider any potential changes to the recommended budget. The boards will adopt a budget by the end of January to be included in the annual report for consideration of the voters on town meeting day in March. After town meeting day, when a budget is passed, the budget implementation process begins. This process would include following the proper procedures as defined in our collective bargaining agreements in the case of a reduction in force, as well as the preparation of contracts for staff that we plan to retain. Additionally, we start the process of bidding out for the myriad of services and supplies as required by our budget plan. The final step of the budget implementation process is to input our approved budgets into our financial accounting system. The budget management process takes place during the fiscal year that the budget is in effect. In order to effectively manage the budget in a fiscally responsible manner, we have internal controls in place which ensure that we live within the financial constraints of the budget approved by the voters. In order to manage costs effectively, a purchase order system is in place to encumber obligations of the school district. Prior to purchase orders being approved, the expenditure lines that are being encumbered are checked against current year-to-date payments and previously approved outstanding encumbrances. Purchase orders are not authorized unless there are funds available to spend, or unless the building administrator freezes expenditures from other unencumbered expenditure lines within their control. Invoices are ultimately approved by building administrators and submitted to the central office for payment processing. On a monthly basis, expenditure reports are reviewed to ensure that expenditures are in line with our budget plan. Our boards are kept informed of any circumstances that we anticipate will require us to deviate materially from the budget approved by the voters. Examples of circumstances that arise from time to time would be unanticipated special education needs, unanticipated enrollment increases that would require the hiring of additional teaching staff, turnover of staff at higher rates of compensation, unanticipated changes in health benefit coverages by employees, etc. In all cases of unanticipated expenditures, our first step is to attempt to freeze unanticipated expenditures from other unencumbered expenditure lines in our budget. We communicate any significant unanticipated expenditures with our boards along with our plan to address the unanticipated need. At the end of the fiscal year, we enter into the closeout, audit, and reporting process of the budgeting cycle. The closeout includes a review of any outstanding purchase orders with building administrators to determine whether they should be kept open at year end. Contracts for services are also reviewed to ensure that all payments have been recorded properly in the appropriate fiscal year. Accruals are made as necessary to account for wages and other expenditures which should be properly reflected in the current fiscal year. Once we've completed the monthly reconciliation process and made all proper adjustments to accurately reflect both the revenues and expenditures for the year, our financial books are closed for the fiscal year and presented to independent auditors who conduct a thorough review of our internal controls, ensure that we are following our established accounting procedures, and that our financial statements properly, consistently, and fairly reflect the financial position of the school district for that year. In addition, year-end figures are reported to the state in several forms, including the annual statistical report, otherwise known as the stat book, grant reports, and special education reports. The final audit report is issued by the auditors and included in the next year's annual report. This closes the loop on a 3-year budget cycle and provides the public with a final measure of accountability for the management of public funds.
Throughout the year-round budget cycle, the roles and responsibilities of key stakeholders within each district are very similar to that for policy. Input on the development of policy is informed from the instructional level, from faculty and staff, with attention to the implications from the place where the rubber meets the roads, between teachers and students where learning happens. In Lamoille South, district and supervisory union administrative teams work closely to translate those needs and priorities into numbers and to manage each school and each K-12 system to deliver on the vision and meet the learning needs within the budget parameters. The board's responsibility is the development and oversight of the vision and holding the administrative team accountable for the management of the budget. And to bring the conversation full circle, I'd like to return to the idea that a well-administered budget, where roles and responsibilities are clear, where there are clearly articulated processes and a multi-year view, and when there's an emphasis on budget as a vision or policy type document, enables a focus of time and resources on what's most important to all of us, students and learning. We encourage you to speak with your administrative team for information about budget development and management in your organization. And we welcome questions or comments at our email addresses, which are posted on this slide. Thank you and good night.
So a thank you to John and Tracy for that presentation, and particularly I wanted to underscore Tracy's closing slide when she referred to budgeting as a visioning document, really similar to policy, laying out guidelines and parameters. That's certainly been a theme we've echoed throughout the evening. In moving forward, we'd really like to ask you what you see as the next steps for your work as a board in terms of your work on budgeting, whether that might be in terms of strategies and practices you've heard about tonight or currently use or have learned from other sources, or maybe there are resources you're now aware of or supports you might need. We'd like to take a snapshot of your plans for next steps. I think the best way for us to get that information from you is for you to type into the question box your thoughts in response to this question about next steps for your board in its work on budgeting. And Steve just added a suggestion that if you have questions at this point, you could send those our way as well.
Obviously, the main point that they're trying to make is that budgeting is not something you do for a month in October or November, but it's an annual, year-round process. And it is worth your time to go and look at the PowerPoints from tonight's presentation at your leisure and get a sense for how they approach annual budgeting. So there's a question here. Is there a place to get norms for all the ideas presented? Do other boards get budget reports throughout the year? I would say it is very normative that boards get monthly reports, certainly quarterly, but I think most boards get them monthly of expenses and revenue against budget, against the plan, so that they can highlight for boards anything that is on target, particularly anything that is off target, to explain what that's about, and also to discuss plans for remediation. That's pretty normative. Is there a place to get norms for all the ideas presented? What I would suggest is if you have a particular area that you were interested in based on tonight's conversation, I would suggest that you send us an email. Our email addresses will be posted up on the screen here shortly, and we would urge you to send us a specific request. We have a lot of supporting information about most of these subjects, but it would be helpful to know specifically what you have in mind. And then there's the question, can you talk about how to evaluate difficult decisions in terms of the school's desired outcomes? I am not clear on how to evaluate different programs, positions, line items with any specificity in terms of a broad outcome like literacy.
I think this is a great example of some monitoring practices that we talked about last week. The board's role is not to go in and look line by line at budgets or individual classrooms or individual students. On the other hand, it is critical for boards to have both a summative picture, oftentimes through performance numbers on test scores and other assessments, of how effective your programming is. The practice that we talked a lot about in the monitoring webinar was ways in which the board can firsthand witness what their students know and are able to do. Again, you're not going to evaluate an individual student or an individual classroom, but you're going to get a firsthand experience with your students' knowledge and skills. So some of the experiences and templates that we walked through last week include those in which boards attend student presentations and performances, and then bring back to the board meeting the broad questions about effectiveness of program. So I hope that goes some distance in responding to your question, Carrie, about how do you have a sense of the effectiveness of your work around literacy. There are examples, and I'll just use one to give some specifics here, where it's called the Community Reads program, and it's an opportunity for all citizens in the community to be in a classroom or in the workplace with students either reading to them or being read to by the adults. So in other words, creating opportunities where you see in action student learning and performance. So again, Steve mentioned the idea of contacting us directly to get some of these resources. They are available on our website, but we can quickly and easily point you to them. So, and that would include the monitoring webinar. If you're having any difficulty finding that on our website, please contact one of us at the numbers and email addresses on the screen in front of you. So I hope you'll continue to send us your questions and suggestions. I think we've touched on the ones that have come up through the typewritten question box. Steve, any other comments you want to make before we close?
No, other than to thank you all for joining us for this event. We absolutely understand that by definition board members are very busy people, and obviously you're taking your responsibilities very seriously to take another evening out to have these kinds of conversations. We are here to support you. We exist to support board members all over the state. We will be very involved with the legislature this year as they look at all kinds of options for how they might do something about education spending. We will be keeping people informed about those discussions. We'll try to prevent bad things from happening in terms of, twists on the education finance system or other things, some of which were proposed last year and didn't happen. But by the same token, we as school boards need to take this task very, very seriously and understand that it's our work that generates the budgets that then generates the need for the state to raise money. So it's a symbiotic thing. It's a shared responsibility. We need to be partners with the state and with the legislature while we really devote so much of our time locally to trying to make sure that our kids have the very best education they can. So it's a tough balancing act, but again, we appreciate you spending this time.